Well, good afternoon. How is everyone? Well, it has been an interesting week, let me tell you. This week we did our annual karate camp here at the church. So I have been here every day, most all day, every day this week, working with the children that we had. We had our, yesterday, my aunt and uncle celebrated their 50th anniversary. So I went and spent time with my family yesterday, all the while nursing a 10 millimeter kidney stone that I have to have removed by surgery a week from now. So pray for me. I do have to be put under anesthesia to have the surgery. There are times when you'll see me just go, and that's what it is.
It's too big to use the force on them.
Yeah, I wish, I wish I could find someone with a healing hand, but so far that has not happened. But no, been looking forward to this week, looking forward to tonight, because tonight we're going to be talking about the subject of the book of Revelation. This is the last class in our survey of the New Testament. And after tonight is over, after the class is concluded, if you are doing your work for the certificate, then you have a month to turn in your paper. Now, I know Miss Daisy, you're doing certificate work, and I'm not sure how many others are, but those of you who are, since we don't have another class until after the baby comes, send it to me via email, and that way I can pull it into my iPad, I can grade it with my pen, and I can send it back to you via email. Doesn't even have to go on paper. That makes it a little easier. And if you have any questions at the end of tonight about the course or about what we're expected of in the paper, please come and see me. Also, if you're planning to do your certificate, I do need to see your notes if you brought them. If not, you can show them to me later. Send the pictures of them, pictures of your notes to me. I've had people do that and this is for the online class too, because I know that we have a few people that are online. If you are in this class, the two major things that you have to turn in for your certificate is your research paper and your notebook showing that you've kept up with the class notes. And if you're not in class, you should still be taking notes, and you should send me those notes. You can either take pictures of them if you're handwriting your notes, or you can simply send me the typed out if you're typing out your notes, if you're at home doing this. All right. Any questions before we begin?
I do have one.
Yes, sir.
One of my sets of notes I turned in with my church notes by accident, and they got so away. I think that is my fault, of course.
Okay. Is that for one class?
Yeah, one class.
That's fine. As long as I see a consistency in your note taking. If you missed one class worth of notes, that's fine.
Actually, I threw them away so I can be a witness to them.
You're a witness, huh?
Yeah.
When you came in tonight, Caleb gave you all a packet of handouts, and this is where we're going to be spending most of our time this evening, is on the handouts. There are 3 pages, even though there are 4 pages because I accidentally photocopied the last page twice. We are going to begin on the one that is entitled Perspectives on Revelation and the Millennium. Before we begin, though, let's pray. Father, I thank you for your word. I thank you for the study of the word. Lord, what a blessing it is to get to study your word. I pray for every person here that you would open our minds to the truth, open our ears to the truth. Lord, as we were just talking beforehand, we have so much to give thanks to you for, because of all the things that you've done even in this week. And yet, Lord, I know that there are many people out there who see things that happen like what happened in the court case this week, and they begin to run to the newspapers and try to interpret the Bible with the newspaper. And Lord, that often happens with the book of Revelation. I pray, Lord, that we would be better students than that, better scholars than that, and not let every wind that blows make us think that we need to reinterpret our text. Lord, help us to have good minds tonight and fill us with your Spirit to understand your word. In Jesus' name, amen. When I was a young man, I guess I still am, sort of. When I was a younger man, there was a set of books that were very popular called Left Behind. Left Behind was written by Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins. Jerry Jenkins is a very good fiction writer, and he was the one who was responsible for characters and storylines. But Tim LaHaye was the preacher who was responsible for the theology that went into the books of Left Behind. And he wrote an accompanying book to the series Left Behind, and the accompanying book was the theological underpinning of the Left Behind narrative. And it was based on a very specific understanding of the book of Revelation. And so tonight we are going to examine the book of Revelation, and we're going to do so knowing that most of us come to this subject with at least a little bit of prior baggage. And it doesn't mean that it's necessarily wrong, it's just something that we should recognize. Like, for instance, I will often be in conversations with people, and someone will say, well, yeah, I think Elon Musk is the Antichrist or something, right? I don't think Elon Musk is the Antichrist. But if someone says that, let's say someone says they think Mark Zuckerberg is the Antichrist, or they think, who's the guy in charge of Amazon? The richest guy in the world, Bezos, that he's the Antichrist. The a priori assumption that is often accompanying that line of reasoning is the idea that there is coming a day when there is going to be a man who rises to the powerful position of leader of the world, and that we will be forced to either obey him or obey Christ, and that man is referred to as the Antichrist. Now, I'm not saying that won't happen. I'm just saying that is a very specific understanding of Revelation, and it's one understanding, and it isn't necessarily the right one. But yet people have that assumption because so many of us have been reared in churches where those assumptions were just, assumed. They were just, everybody believes this. I've told the story before. When I was teaching a Bible study at First Coast High School, I used to go to the high school and teach. It was a Bible club, and I would do the Bible study there. And the lady said, 7-year tribulation, rapture, and all this stuff. And I said, well, that's one interpretation. And she goes, what do you mean that's one interpretation? I said, well, that's not the way everyone interprets Revelation. She goes, that's the only way. That's it. There's not any other way to interpret it. I said, no, I think, but it was the only way she'd ever been exposed to. And here's the thing that we need to remember. A few names just to throw at you. John Nelson Darby, who lived in the middle of the 19th century, was responsible for the system of thought that we would nowadays call dispensationalism. Dispensationalism proposed a very distinct way of interpreting the Bible, which made a key distinction between Israel and the church. It argued that there were very specific and distinct promises that were given to Israel, most notably land and seed. I've been preaching about this in Genesis, so I don't disagree with that in the sense that that is the promise that was given to Abraham. He would be given a land, and he would be given a seed or an offspring. And that this was a physical promise which would have a physical fulfillment. Whereas the church would be a spiritual kingdom distinct from Israel and would serve as a parenthesis between God's working with Israel prior to Christ and God's working with Israel after the return of Christ. And so the picture of dispensationalism is that the church functions as a parenthesis. I'll give you this idea. You have Israel in the Old Testament, and then you have the church in the New Testament, and then Christ will return, and then you will have Israel be the focus again during the millennium. And so the church is raptured out prior to the millennium and comes back with Christ prior to the millennium and rules and reigns with Christ for 1,000 years. Okay? So in this particular scheme, the church is not the focus. Israel is the focus. And the church is, as I said, and this is the words of John MacArthur actually, the church is a parenthesis in the plan of God, but not the focus. That's one of my biggest issues with dispensationalism is the church becomes a parenthesis rather than the focus. Rather than the fulfillment of the promises to Israel, it's a parenthesis in the middle of the promises. You got the promises before and the promises later, and the church becomes a parenthesis. Now, this particular system was then popularized by a man named C.I. Scofield. That's okay. C.I. Scofield was put together a Bible, a reference Bible, a study Bible. And it's called the Scofield Reference Bible. And Scofield's Reference Bible became one of the best-selling study Bibles in the history of the church. You got one?
Yeah.
I have one. I have my wife's grandmother's Bible, which was a Scofield study Bible. The old joke was, my hope is built on nothing less than Scofield's notes and Moody Press. I mean, that was it was that popular. Everybody had this Bible. And what the C.I. Scofield Bible had the charts in it, and the theology of Darby and his dispensationalism was charted in the Scofield Bible, so it became very common and prolific. And this is why it's not in one denomination. You don't just see this in Baptists. You see this in Pentecostals. You see this in others as well, right? Anywhere that Bible went, it sort of took its theology with it, the end-time theology. Now, keep in mind, this is all part of a larger movement which began in the mid-19th century, which was called the Adventist movement. The Adventist movement means the arrival. That's what Advent means, the arrival. And the Adventist movement gave birth to groups such as the SDA Church, which is known as the Seventh-day Adventists. They were ones who believed that we should be worshiping on Saturday, that was the fourth commandment, and that's reference to Saturday. In fact, I may be interviewing a Seventh-day Adventist on my show. The guy that I work with at the funeral home, I do funerals, I saw him today. He's a pastor in an SDA church. And I said, I would love to just ask you questions. How do you get to the conclusions that you get to? I'm not going to berate him, but I want to know how they arrive at some of the conclusions, because they have conclusions that are vastly different than my own. I want to know why. How do you get there? Because they believe in things like investigative judgment, which is an entirely different view of how we are reckoned right with God. They have a view that Ellen G. White was a prophetess. So there are a lot of things in the SDA church that I would disagree with, but I'm hoping I can get a chance to interview them. So we have the SDA church. There's other Adventist movements. Adventist, again, means this was all about end times. It was all about end times. So what's another Adventist movement? Anybody know?
LDS.
Well, it's actually the Jehovah's Witnesses. Yeah. So you got the Watchtower, or the JW movement is an Adventist movement. They were at the same time, and I would say still looking forward to end times, but there's so much other things in the LDS. There's so much in Mormonism that is, Mormonism is less Christian than Islam. I mean, as far as how they view like God and all of that, they're so wildly abstract. But the JWs, the Jehovah's Witnesses, they're Adventist. There's also something called Advent Christian Church. I don't know if you've ever seen one of those, an Advent Christian Church. They're all part of the Adventist movement, which was birthed in the mid 1800s. And my point is this: there has been, in the last 200 years or greater, 250 years, a heightened conversation within the general body of Christ regarding the end times, because people felt like, look at all the church has been through. The church has gone through the early centuries where we were persecuted, and then through the time of the Holy Roman Empire, and then the medieval period where there was a rise in things like asceticism and monkery and things like that, and then that gave birth to the Renaissance, which ultimately led to the Reformation. Right? And then Columbus discovers America, and now there's an entire new world that can be evangelized, and the gospel can flourish, and the gospel does flourish in the new world. And the pilgrims come, and they bring the gospel here, and there's this new land of milk and honey. It's no longer over in the desert in the Middle East, but it's in America, right? And that's the land of milk and honey. And there's this idea that we found the promised land, and now it's this new thing, right? From a historic perspective, you can see where people start thinking, Jesus must be right around the corner. He must be coming back because we've reached the point. This is why so many of our spiritual ancestors were post-millennial. And we'll explain what that means in a little while. But they looked forward to Christ overtaking the world and the world becoming Christian. That's what post-millennialism is, the idea that the world is going to become Christian. Then the atom bomb falls on Hiroshima. Everything changes. Because more people die in the 20th century than any other century prior at the hands of men. And we see the massive amount of inhumanity, man to man, more so than ever before, through 2 world wars. Unlike anything we'd ever seen. Again, a bomb that can not only kill, but can vaporize an entire city and burn people's shadows into the walls. Unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Jewish people put into concentration camps, and to the tune of 6 million slaughtered. Right? These are atrocities that were unthinkable in a time where people thought, the world is getting better. So a new idea comes. Okay, it's not getting better. It's not the post-millennial dream that Christ is going to overtake everything. The new dream is things are just going to keep getting worse and worse and worse, and then Christ is going to rapture us out of that. And the popularity of the dispensational view of the pre-tribulation rapture becomes the hope. And now it's not Christ returning in glory, it's Christ returning as a thief in the night. And he's going to come and snatch us away from all of this evil. And one man will be in the field with another, and he'll be snatched away, right? And they quote Matthew's gospel about the one being snatched away and the other left behind. And that's where, of course, the idea of being left behind comes from. So you see how this is popularized in the last 200 years. And I bring all this up only to say, if you were to go back to the Middle Ages, or back to the early church, back to the time of Augustine, the conversations we have about Revelation weren't being had because these things didn't exist. These conversations didn't exist. I'm not saying they didn't talk about these things, but this idea of Christ right around the corner. In the end, we're the tip of the spear. This is the end. We're there. That's where so many people find themselves, and that's why there's so much fascination with the end times. I mean, you turn on TBN any time of day or any of the Christian stations, you're going to find somebody who's showing you a chart of how the Ukrainian war with Russia is a setup for Gog and Magog, and the Chinese are going to come in and they're going to all funnel down into Jerusalem, and they're going to all bring about this end, and then Jeff Bezos is going to come and Amazon promise out of I don't know. There's all these weird views. So what I have on this sheet is I have a different way of looking at this, and I hope that it's helpful. I didn't get this out of a book. I wrote this myself several years ago. This is 4 perspectives on Revelation, and I want to tell you right away, I don't have any fear in telling you what my perspective is. I put a star next to mine just in case you're wondering where I am. But I am very quick to say that I ain't sure. That just is where I am today. And a few years ago, I was invited to speak at a conference where they were doing a conference on end times. And the only reason I was even considered is I was the only one who was willing to give a preterist perspective. So, I mean, you could throw a stick and hit 20 dispensationalists, but finding a preterist was a little hard. What I want to do tonight is I want to go over this with you and explain why I hold the view I hold. But again, I do so with a caveat of saying I am in no way telling you that I am perfectly correct. I do think I can defend my position, but if you disagree with me, this is not the gospel. This is my understanding of what I would say is the most difficult book of the Bible. One of the most difficult books. I would say Revelation, Ezekiel, latter half of Daniel, all kind of fit together on difficult levels, right? And there's some difficult stuff in other places too. Still kind of scratch my head at some of Ecclesiastes. But I'm just saying, when it comes to interpreting the Bible, there are some passages that I think are very straightforward, very didactic, and then there are other passages that are more difficult. And Revelation, I think, is intended, I'll explain why in a little while, but I do think there's an intentional obscurity because it was written to an audience that was being persecuted. So I think it has signs and symbols that they would have understood as a persecuted body, but that we might not understand the same because we're not where they were. So let's begin. Was this kind of helpful though? Kind of giving you a little history here. Let's begin with the four perspectives. The 4 perspectives are known as preterism, historicism, idealism, and futurism. So let's kind of start breaking those down. All right, so Christ, somewhere around 30 AD, there's a death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. 40 years later, there is the fall of Jerusalem. And that happens under Emperor Titus in AD 70. The distance between those two events is 40 years. The first book of the Bible that was written, probably around 48, 49. We have, I'm using round numbers here, so I'm just going to say 50 is when the books of the Bible begin to be written. And then so from 50 to 70, I believe all the Bible books are written. Some people believe Revelation comes later. We'll talk about that in a bit. But for the sake of right now, I just want you to, for a moment, understand that Revelation is written somewhere in here. If you want to put it after AD 70, I would disagree with you, but some do. I would put it right before AD 70, right here. But we know it's in this general area. Preterism would say, and preterism simply means something that has happened in the past, something that came before. So preterism would say that Revelation was written for the audience about their situation. So it has the audience and the context in mind. And here's, I'll just read it right off the page. Most of the content of Revelation was fulfilled during the lifetime of the original audience, prior to and during the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. So that is preterism. There are two types of preterism. There is full preterism, sometimes called hyperpreterism or consistent preterism, which argues that all the prophecies regarding Jesus' second coming and resurrection of the dead were fulfilled in the first century. That is not what I hold to. And then there's something called partial preterism. Also, I call it orthodox preterism because I do think it fits within the orthodox confines of what we believe about the return of Christ. And it argues that many, if not most of the prophecies of Revelation were fulfilled in the first century, but we still have some yet to come. So would say that most, I would argue Revelation chapter 4 through Revelation 19 is fulfilled in AD 70, that those events. But that there is still things yet to come. Historicism says that most of the content of Revelation is being revealed gradually throughout church history and is still being fulfilled today. So they would say, okay, so you got preterism here. That means it was written here. It was written about this. Historicism doesn't matter when it was written, somewhere in here, and it's fulfilled throughout history in different events. So historicism would be fulfilled in, like for instance, the reformers would have argued for the historicist position because they would say like the Pope was Antichrist, right? That in fact in the Second London Confession it says the Pope is the Antichrist, right? So they would see it from a historic fulfillment position. So they wouldn't take 7 years as being 7 literal years. They would say it's specific to over time. Now the idealist perspective is similar, but a little different. It says most of the content of Revelation is meant to be understood as symbolic or allegorical, portraying the ongoing cosmic battle in the spiritual realm, or the cosmic conflict in the spiritual realm. So idealism is the hardest to nail down. It's sort of like nailing Jello to a wall, because it's basically saying there's always conflict going on, and Revelation is just talking about the constant conflict that's always going on. Now, the one place I do agree with the idealist in this respect is I do believe that Revelation is cyclical. Like, for instance, when it talks about the 7 seals and then the 7 vials, and then the 7 trumpets, I think that that's the same thing being expressed again. I don't think it's 3 in a row. I think it's a rehashing of the same event. And so that would be an idea where it's because you'll see the same event happen. You'll see the birth of Christ in the different ones in different ways described. And so you see sort of a cyclical thing going back to the dragon and back to the birth of these things. So idealism says it's just all allegorical. It's about the constant struggle of good and evil. Now, futurism is the one that most people hold to. So I'm going to write it differently. Write it with blue. Hope you're not anybody's colorblind. Futurism says that Revelation was written somewhere in this time period. Usually they say about 80 to 90, they argue, was written somewhere in that time period. And they say it was written to 7 churches at the time, which we know that's true, but that it stops having relevance to the original audience at chapter 4. So at chapter 4, it stops having relevance to the original audience. This is the part that I don't like. Because ultimately what it says is there's a gap of time where sometime in the future, chapter 4 begins and a 7-year literal tribulation begins. And that's where typically you'll hear the rapture. That's what begins that 7-year tribulation. So the idea then is most of what was written in Revelation had nothing of value to its original audience. You get where I have the issue with that.
Yeah.
Because the content of the book from chapters 4 on only describes something that none of the original audience would ever see or understand. Right? And so that's where I have my issue. So the futurist perspective is seen in the dispensational view, because they say everything about Revelation is still yet to come. Everything about Revelation is still yet to come. The preterist perspective, which is again the position I take, is that most of Revelation has already come, and it happened in the audience to whom it was written. It was written to an audience about an event that they were about to experience, and the event that they experienced was the fall of Jerusalem, which had major impact on a theological scale and on a historical scale. And so what John was preparing the church for was the fall of Jerusalem. So again, these are the different perspectives. And if you come at the end and you say, hey man, I'm here, I'm a card-carrying futurist, I don't care. I mean, I don't care, but I mean, I'm not going to argue with you. It's fine. That's where John MacArthur is. That's where almost everybody is. But you say, well, why am I the way I am? Because I just like to be obtuse. No, that's not. No, I legitimately, I tell you the people who have probably had the most influence on me in this position. One was a guy named Gary DeMar. Now, Gary DeMar has a different view than I do, but Gary DeMar, first time I ever sat in on a conference of his, he was so, because this is what the dispensationalists will always say, we take it literally. We interpret it literally. And then he said, but you don't. Because when you see the locusts and you say, well, those locusts are Apache helicopters. Well, you're not taking it literally anymore, because the locusts are either locusts or they're not. If they're Apache helicopters, then you've stopped taking it literally. Right? And I remember that one quote, and I thought, that's actually pretty smart. Because I always heard my whole life was the dispensationalists are the only literalists. But it's not true. It just depends on how you define what literal means. They're literal because they argue that they hold to a specific 7 years. And the Bible does talk about 3.5 years and then 3.5 years, which adds up to 7. And so they want to take that literal. But then you get to Daniel's 70 weeks, and you end up with 69 weeks. But then there's a gap between 69 and 70, right? Yeah, right? Aren't we in the gap? Aren't we waiting for the 70th week to begin? And the 70th week is the tribulation. Am I right? Yeah. So is it a literal 70 weeks, or is it 69 plus an infinity amount and then 7? See, that's the issue, right? Is there's so many different views, there's so many different positions on this. And so my first thing was Gary DeMar. Then I read Dr. R.C. Sproul's book, The Last Days According to Jesus, where he looks at Matthew 24 and Revelation and talks about the fall of Jerusalem and says, here is how these things could fit into that. And a lot of pieces started to fit together for me. And so that was helpful. There's also another man, I can't think of his name, I'll get it for you during the break. There's another man who was very influential who wrote his doctoral dissertation on why the fall of Jerusalem fits within the Revelation narrative, and it was very helpful to me. So all these were that was Kenneth Gentry, Ken Gentry, doctoral dissertation. So again, like I said, I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm just giving you things to think about. But yes, go ahead.
So you would say the preterist view almost looks at it like 2/3 of the things have already been happening, the other third are rolling out as we live now, right? Kind of.
I would say this. I would say if you take the preterist view, we are in the millennium now. If you're amillennial, and I am, and we're going to get to the millennium in a minute. Post-millennialists would say we're waiting for the millennium to begin, and the millennium is not Christ's return, but it's Christ's church overtaking the world. So in fact, let's get to the millennium positions now. Let's look at the three perspectives, because we've seen there are four perspectives on Revelation, but now let's talk about the three perspectives of the millennium. Do y'all know what I mean when I say millennium? Huh?
The millennial reign, that's what
Yes, Revelation chapter 20. In fact, Jay, pull out your Bible and read it for us.
Revelation chapter 20.
Chapter 20, beginning in verse 1. Yep.
Ready?
Yep.
And I saw an angel coming down out of heaven, having the key to the abyss and holding in his hand a great chain. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil or Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. He threw him into the abyss and locked and sealed it over him, to keep him from deceiving the nations anymore until the 1,000 years were ended. After that he must be set free for a short time. I saw thrones on which there were seated those who had been given authority to judge. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony about Jesus and because of the word of God. They had not worshipped the beast or its image and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, but they will be the priests of God and of Christ, who will reign with him for 1,000 years.
Yep. Okay, very good. All right, so what we have is we have a clear statement in Revelation chapter 20 that there's going to be 1,000 years and there's going to be a reign of saints. It said that clearly, right? That the saints are going to reign, right? You're reading. Yeah. No, I mean, yes or no? We agree. Okay. Reign of saints, and it says they're going to reign with Christ. That Satan will be bound. So we have a binding of Satan, and he is going to be released at the end. Right? He's going to be released at the end for a season where he'll be able to make war with the saints, right? Because the saints are reigning. So he's going to be released to make war with the saints. Okay. So this 1,000 years has created a major, major divide in theological conversation. Because there are those who would say this 1,000 years represents after Christ's return. So that those would be called pre-millennial. All right, premillennial, because pre means before. So they're saying Christ returns and the millennium begins. So they say Christ returns and so you have Christ coming and then the millennium, then the 1,000 years. And then you have the post-millennial. Post, of course, meaning after. That is that the 1,000 years happens. What happens during the 1,000 years? The saints are reigning, Satan is bound, and then Christ returns. And what would be the difference? Well, in the premillennial view, Christ returns to begin the millennium. In the postmillennial view, Christ returns to end the millennium, because the world has, for 1,000 years, seen the rule and reign of Christ throughout the world. The postmillennial view is very popular right now. It's being popularized by guys like Jeff Durbin, Doug Wilson, a lot of guys right now, a lot of internet guys. Not that they're, they have churches. They're not, they're pastors. I'm an internet guy if you want to be ugly. But a lot of guys who are popular on the internet are popularizing postmillennialism, because postmillennialism is the idea that the world will become captured or put under Christ's footstool. The world will become essentially subject to Christ, and then he will return. So the world will become a Christian world, and then Christ will return. Okay? And a lot of this is very positive. I always say my postmillennial brothers and sisters are the most what is the word I'm looking for? Optimistic. I kept thinking pessimistic, but that's the other. They're the most optimistic because they're always looking forward and saying, in fact, I heard Dr. James White. Dr. James White, one of my favorite theologians, recently became a postmillennialist. Yeah, and it surprised me. I come home one day, my wife has asked me, why aren't we postmillennialists? Jeff Durbin's postmillennial, Dr. White's postmillennial, why aren't we postmillennial? And I'll explain why in a minute, but the point is, it's becoming very popular. And Dr. White even argues, well, what if we're in the early church? What if the church is still in its infancy? We've only been here for 2,000 years. The world's been here for thousands of years before that. What if the church has another 4,000 years to go before Christ returns? But what if, though? I mean, you ain't got 4,000 years. Keep this in mind, sister. You're in your end times, and so am I. People always talk about, am I in the end times? Yeah, you are, because ain't none of us going to live 100 more years. We're all in our end times, right? So, yeah, you're not going to make it. But imagine if the world did go on another, what could the church accomplish? If God raised up another Martin Luther or another John Calvin. And maybe he is. We got our Vodi Bachams and our John MacArthur's. He's raising men up, right? What if he's raising up another generation of men to storm the gates of hell and bring the gospel to the lost world? What if, right? There is some optimism that's comforting, that maybe there could one day be a world that is subject to Christ and he returns to a world that's looking forward to his return. Right? That's postmillennialism, is that Christ would return to a world that's prepared and waiting for him. Right? And it's optimistic. I'll put that here. It is full of optimism. Let me tell you something. This week, when Roe versus Wade got struck down, man, every theonomist I know was, I can't dance, but they were boogieing because they were like, see, we've been fighting the fight for 50 years. And God saw it through. And he didn't leave us to shame, right? We fight the good fight, and he's going to win. That's the one thing about postmillennialists I like. It's always about Christ is going to have the victory. And we always sing that, right? Victory in Jesus, right? So there is some positive. There's good. Premillennialism says Christ will return before the 1,000 years. And typically the view is this will be preceded by 7 years of tribulation. So what's the view there? Things are going to get bad before Christ returns. Notice the difference. And this is a massive distinction. Because this says things are going to get great before Christ returns. But this says things are going to get a tribulation as if the world has never seen. Right? And then Christ returns to put his enemies under his feet and establish his kingdom whereby he will reign for 1,000 years on the earth. Right? And then at the end of this 1,000 years, eternity begins. Right? So, premillennialism is unfortunately pessimistic. and I don't think they would disagree. There is a certain pessimism that goes along with premillennialism, because the idea is it's just going to get worse until Christ comes. Right? And so Two views, one optimistic, one pessimistic. And along comes Pastor Keith with his odd third view. And I hold the view known as amillennialism. And amillennialism says this, and I'm going to read it right off your page. The kingdom of God was inaugurated at Christ's resurrection, and Christ is currently reigning from heaven during this present age, and this age is the millennium. According to amillennialism, this age is the millennium, which will last until he returns to usher in the eternal state. So, this is also called Nook millennialism, or realized millennialism, or inaugurated millennialism, for those who don't want to call it amillennialism. So let's look at amillennialism. Ah is a prefix which means none or no, like atheism. And basically when it says no millennium, it doesn't mean there's not a millennium, it just means it's not a literal 1,000 years. So amillennialism says it's not a literal 1,000 years. And what it says is that at the cross, when Jesus died, that began, or rather, at the resurrection, that began the reign. Christ ascended to heaven where he is seated where? At the right hand of the Father, right? He is currently reigning from heaven. And this is the part that people would argue with me about, but stay with me at least long enough to, if you're going to argue, at least argue about what I'm really saying. We would argue not only is Christ reigning in heaven, but we would say he also reigns upon the earth in the hearts of his people. And therefore, there is a reign of Christ in the heart of every saint. And there is a binding of Satan. And this is the part where people lose their mind, because what do you mean Satan's bound? We got rabid abortion and LGBT and all this stuff, and I get that. But here's where the binding comes in. The Bible tells us that as the gospel is proclaimed within the world, that Satan is struck down by that work. And we see this in the story of Jesus sending out his disciples. And when they come back to him, he says, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven.
I love that verse.
At what? At the proclaiming of the gospel. So as the gospel goes forth, Satan is bound. That's the picture that, again, amillennialism does take an allegorical, at least in this sense, understanding of the reigning of the saints and binding. The reigning of Christ in our hearts and the binding of Satan in the world. And I think we have a fairly good explanation for when it says he's loosed for a season. Because I do think that there is coming a time in the future, some point, where there is going to be a time where there's going to be tribulation. I do look forward to a time of bad. Now, that doesn't make me premillennial, but I do think there's going to be a time where there will be a rising of good and bad, a battle of good and bad, and then perhaps even, dare I say it, Armageddon, which will usher in the return of the King, and whereby he will put his enemies under his feet. But I don't hold to that with absolute. I think that's possible. So when people talk about coming famine or coming battle, I say, yeah, it's possible. But it might be 100 years from now. It might be 1,000 years from now. We don't know. Right? But it does say Satan will be loose for a season, and that he will raise up enemies against the Lord, but that he will be finally destroyed at that end. And that's where I think that's the end. The end is not the millennium. The millennium is over by then. The end is eternity. We go from here to eternity. That's a movie. No, so from here to eternity. We go from here to eternity, not from here to another 1,000 years of being here. Now, if I find out I'm wrong, and I end up in a millennium with Jesus, and he's ruling and reigning for 1,000 years, and I'm with him, blessed be the name of the Lord. Right? If the church gets raptured out tomorrow, and I'm flying through the air, blessed be the name of the Lord. I'll be looking at John MacArthur going, You was right! Because I don't think, and I would say this, I've talked about the concentric circles before. The center circle is that thing that all Christians must believe to be Christians. Then the next circle is those things which must, keep churches with, like things like baptism and stuff, or maybe on that second tier where churches should all agree on baptism. Churches should all agree on what makes somebody a church member. Those things are secondary, but they're still important. But then there are those things that are third tier, tertiary things that we would say, even within a church, you can disagree. We had an elder in this church for years. His name was Richard Taylor. I loved him to death. Richard and I were good friends. He was a graduate of Dallas Theological Seminary. And he was a dyed-in-the-wool, dispensational, premillennial, he actually was a mid-trib rapture guy because he had studied it, and he told me it was a mid-trib rapture. But the point is, we served as elders together, and we disagreed on that view. And any time I taught on it, I was very fair to say, we have differences of opinion here, and that's okay. Because I really don't think that this should separate people within a church. I think there can be differences here. The big issue I can see is when it comes to things like how do we engage with the world. Because post-millennialists tend to be very focused on social action because they believe they're ushering in the kingdom of Christ through the gaining of ground in the world, right? They talk about the overcoming and redeeming culture, overcoming and redeeming media, overcoming and redeeming entertainment, overcoming and redeeming politics, overcoming and redeeming all of these areas, right? And that's good. And this is why most of the guys who are standing outside the abortion clinics and things like that, a lot of those guys are post-millennial because they actually think in terms like that. We're redeeming society through Christ. Not bad. It's just, right? So within a church, that may be some of the areas where there could be some disagreement. Because the premillennialists will sometimes sit back and say, it's all going to hell anyway. I don't expect it to get better. I only expect it to get worse. That's how some folks look at it. And so I can see how that divide could come up in a church, but it doesn't have to. There can be differences on this and it not be. Here's the thing, and keep this in mind, and I'm going to close, take our break on this. There are two creeds from the early church that most churches would affirm. The Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. Both of them reference the coming of Christ. But listen to what they say. The Apostles' Creed. He ascended to heaven, is seated at the right hand of God the Father Almighty, and from there he will come to judge the living and the dead. Doesn't mention a millennium, doesn't mention any of that. It just says he's coming. Right? Nicene Creed, same thing. He will come again with glory to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom will never end. Doesn't talk about a millennium, doesn't talk about whether you see Revelation as preterist or futurist or whatever. And that's, I think, as long as we can all affirm that Christ is coming. And when he comes, whether he comes and initiates a millennium or he comes at the end of a millennium or whatever, I think as long as we can all affirm that Christ is, that's what we do when we take communion. We show forth the Lord's death until what? Until he comes. And so if you can't affirm Christ is coming, and see that's where preterism, hyper-preterism is dangerous. Because they said Christ already came. And that's dangerous. And that's the position that I think goes outside of the bounds of orthodoxy. That Christ fully fulfilled everything in AD 70, and I don't believe that. So when we come back after the break, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I think did happen in AD 70, and we'll finish up with that. So take 5. All right, guys. Well, we are getting to the end of the class, and I do want to mention I gave you 2 other handouts. We spent all that time on this handout. Here are 2 other handouts, and these are just for you to put in your notes, and you can use them for your own personal study. This one here gives a charted difference between dispensational premillennialism, historic premillennialism, amillennialism, and postmillennialism. And the one great thing that they all agree on is, will Jesus return physically? Yes, that's the thing I like to point out about this, is no matter where you stand on any of these positions, you stand on a return of Christ. And that's where we can all agree. And after that, we can disagree on some of the more particulars. The other thing, this is actually from the Rose Book of Charts, which is the colored Rose Book that I mentioned. I think Miss Daisy has it. A few other people have it. In the colored form, this is actually nice and helpful. It's a little harder to read in the black and white, but you notice under amillennialism, you have this position here. That would be a pretty faithful representation of what I was saying. For the last bit, I want to talk about what happened in AD 70, because I talk about that a lot in my New Testament class, but at this last portion I just want to read to you about this historic event and some of the things that happened during that fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. This is one of the best attested historical events of the ancient world. We know from the Gospels that during the life of Jesus, Jerusalem was under Roman occupation. This had begun in 63 BC when Roman General Pompey captured Jerusalem. The Jews despised the Romans for their oppressive taxation and occupation. We know that because during the time of Christ, the Jews who had sided with Rome and become tax collectors were hated, not even allowed in the temple. Remember? In AD 66, about 33 years after Christ's death, burial, and resurrection, the Jews revolted. So in AD 66, there was a Jewish revolt. The revolt was somewhat successful. They established a revolutionary government. And I think, if I remember correctly, they even established their own coined money. Like they tried to set up their own government apart from the Romans. Boy, wouldn't you love to have one of those coins? We talk about rare. In response to this, the Emperor Nero sent General Vespasian to meet the Jewish forces. And the result was that the majority of the Jewish forces were pushed into Jerusalem, and Vespasian became the emperor in 69. In April of AD 70, Roman General Titus, the son of Vespasian, besieged Jerusalem. And by the way, if you want, I can send you all a copy of this. If it's easier, you don't have to try to write everything down. Just send me an email. I'll send it out, because this is all, I think, very helpful. Josephus, many of you have heard of the writings of Josephus, was a former commander among the Jewish forces. He was captured by Rome, and because of his position, he attempted to negotiate a settlement. But it was resisted on both sides. The Romans encircled the city, they cut off supplies, and they drove the people within the city to starvation. It was near the time of Passover, and therefore it was filled with visitors. So Jerusalem is filled with people. It is surrounded by armies. No in or out. No supplies in. Nothing gets out. And the people begin to starve. Some even resorted to cannibalism. By the month of August, the Romans had breached... Let me begin again. By the month of August, the Romans breached through the final defenses, and they massacred many of those who remained, and in total there were over 1 million dead. They destroyed the second temple. This is often referred to as Herod's temple, because remember there was the temple of Solomon that was destroyed by the Babylonians. Then you had the second temple was actually Zerubbabel's temple, but it never had the glory of the first. And then Herod erected his temple, which stood during the time of Christ. That was the temple that Christ said, "Not one stone will be on another." Well, I believe that's a prophecy about this event. The only trace of the second temple left was the western wall, which is now referred to as the Wailing Wall. Wasn't actually part of the temple itself, but it's part of that original structure, and that's where Jews go today, and they write little prayers and stick it in the wall and pray. I want to read to you from the eyewitness account of Josephus. Quote, "The rebels shortly after attacked the Romans again, and a clash followed between the guards of the sanctuary and the troops who were putting out the fire inside the inner court. The latter routed the Jews and followed in hot pursuit right up to the temple itself. Then one of the soldiers, without awaiting any orders and with no dread of so monumentous a deed, but urged on by some supernatural force, snatched a blazing piece of wood, and climbing on another soldier's back, he hurled the flaming brand through a low golden window that gave access on the north side to the rooms that surrounded the sanctuary. And as the flames shot up, the Jews let out a shout of dismay that matched the tragedy. They flocked to the rescue with no thought of sparing their lives or husbanding their strength, for the sacred structure that they had constantly guarded with such devotion was vanishing before their eyes." That's how he wrote about the destruction of the temple. It was burned. Now again, Matthew 24, Jesus says in verse 1, it says, "Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came and point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he said, 'You see these? Truly I say to you, there will not be here left one stone upon another that will not be thrown down.'" And we see that again in Luke chapter 21, verses 5 to 6. This event was monumental in regard to its significance to the Jewish nation. They were now without their holy and sacred place where they worshipped and made sacrifices. It would be impossible not to ascribe some special significance to this event on God's prophetic calendar. And the question is, what and how much significance should be given to this event? I want to be honest with you. Before I started studying preterism, I almost never heard anybody talk about this event, because people would talk about the rapture, or people would talk about this. Hardly anybody ever talked about the fall of Jerusalem. But I hope that one of the things I hope you've gotten out of this class over the last 8 weeks is just how significant I think this event is. Even if you don't think this is where Revelation was fulfilled, at least on the perspective of the ending of the Old Covenant practices and the ushering in of the New Covenant age. And as we said, it was like the baton going from one to the other, and there's that time where both are running along. And so you see the ending of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. And that time in between, this 40-year period between, sorry, wrong. I forgot I wrote something else. And this event just has, to me, major significance. So preterism, the position that I hold, Orthodox preterism, teaches that the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 was the major transitional moment in history. And I want to show you 2 places in Revelation where I would make my argument. If someone were to say, well, where do you get this in Revelation? In Revelation chapter 1, beginning at verse 1, going to verse 3, we see time-sensitive passages. In fact, I'll read it. Revelation chapter 1. Now again, imagine that this is being written prior to AD 70, because that's my contention, is written prior to AD 70. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants the things that must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John, who bore witness to the word of God and to the testimony of Jesus Christ, even all that he saw. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written in it, for the time is near. So in 3 verses, we have 2 references to time, and the time is now. The time is near. The time is soon. The time is taking place. That's the issue I have with someone who says that the bulk of Revelation is still yet to come, because it's being written to an audience for an audience. It's not being written to an audience, in my opinion, it's not being written to an audience for a later audience. It's being written for an immediate audience that this is going to be of great value to them. So you ask the question, okay, well then who is the beast? Who is the Antichrist? I would argue that the beast is Nero himself. In fact, the number 666, which is often attributed to some kind of possible computer chip or something that may be placed in the hand in the future, that number is the number of, if you take Neron Kaiser, which is the Greek, and you put that in Hebrew, it's the number of 666. It adds up to 666, and so there are ways to explain even those passages in regard to what was going on then. And what's interesting is Nero's name, his nickname, was the Beast. He would dress in, and this is fairly well documented in historical sources, that he would dress in the skins of an animal, and he would have men tied up, and he would go and tear them apart, biting them and ripping at them to fulfill a bloodlust, pretending that he was himself an animal. We know that he lit people on fire in his garden. He would dip them in pitch and light them on fire to light his garden, and so Nero had a tremendous hatred and detestability that I think would fit the category of the beast. And somebody says, well, what about the mark on the hand and the forehead? And this is where things get a little more difficult, because we've always been assuming that that's going to be some kind of a chip, right? I mean, I don't know if you've ever heard that. Somebody says it's like going to be a computer chip, or it's going to be a tattoo, a barcode. You know, that was the picture before computer chips were a thing. It was going to be a barcode that was stamped or tattooed on the hand. It's interesting, though, that there are different ways to interpret that concept of the hand and what it's doing. And give me just a second here, because I do have this. This is an interesting thought. Let me pull it up. Sorry, jumping down a little bit. Oh, and I have the number. I'm going to send you guys all this, because I do have where Nun Resh Vav Nun Kaf Samik Resh. That's the letters for the Hebrew name of Nero Kaiser, and it's 50, 206, 50, 100, 60, and 200. It adds up to 666. But the thing about the mark on the hand and the mark on the forehead, there's also a corresponding mark for believers. If you read Revelations, believers have a mark on them for their faith. And so the question becomes, is it a real mark, is it a physical mark, or is it allegiance? And here's what I think we should keep in mind. Our head and our hand represents our thoughts and our deeds. Our thoughts and our deeds. And how do we show allegiance? Through what we think and what we do. And so the idea of the mark being on the hand and the head, how do we show our allegiance to Christ? By what we do, by what we think, how we behave. And I do think that that ties into the idea of the mark of the beast. All right. Running low on time, and I want to read you one last thing. The big question outside of mark of the beast and Antichrist, all that stuff, is what about all these astrological miracles that's supposed to happen in Revelation? The sun going black as sackcloth, and the moon turning to blood, and the skies being rolled back like a scroll. I want to read to you from the Old Testament how the prophets described God's judgment. Listen to this from Isaiah 13. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel and with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation and to destroy its sinners from it. From the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark as its rising. The moon will not shed its light. I will punish the world for its evil and the wicked for their iniquity. I will put an end to the pomp of the arrogant and lay low the pompous pride of the ruthless. I will make people more rare than fine gold and mankind than the gold of Ophir. Therefore I will make the heavens tremble and the earth will be shaken out of its place at the wrath of the Lord of hosts and the day of the fierce anger. We say, well, that's about the destruction of the end of the world. No, it's not. Isaiah 13 is about the destruction of Babylon. But how is it described? In apocalyptic language. It's described as the earth shaking and the stars falling, because that was the picture of judgment. And when Babylon fell to judgment under the Medo-Persian army, that's the picture. And so when Jerusalem falls under Titus, that's the picture. And that's the revelation. To understand Revelation in that regard, you have to understand the Old Testament prophets, because John is writing like an Old Testament prophet. Isaiah 34, verses 3 to 5. Their slain will be cast out. The stench of their corpses shall rise. The mountains shall flow with blood. All the hosts of heaven shall rot away. The skies will roll up like a scroll. All the hosts shall fall. All leaves fall from the vine, like leaves falling from the fig tree. For my sword has drunk its fill in the heavens. Behold, it descends from judgment upon Edom, upon the people I have devoted to destruction. You would think that's about the destruction of the end of the world. It's not. It's about the destruction of Edom, which was something that happened in the Old Testament. And notice, the skies roll up like a scroll. That's a direct statement that John references in Revelation 6:14. But listen to this from Josephus again. These are things that I can't prove this, but these were eyewitness accounts of things that happened during the fall of Jerusalem. This is from Josephus' Jewish Wars. Besides these signs, he was already talking about some other signs. A few days after the feast, on the 21st day of the month of Artemisius, a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable were it not related by those who saw it, and were not the events that followed it of so considerable a nature as to deserve such signals. For before sunsetting, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running around among the clouds and surrounding the cities. Moreover, at the feast which we call Pentecost, as the priests were going by night into the inner court of the temple, as their custom was to perform their sacred ministrations, they said that in the first place they felt a quaking, and they heard a great noise, and after that they heard a sound as of a great multitude, saying, "Let us remove hence." So they're seeing signs in the heavens. They're hearing sounds as they do ministrations in the temple. And Tacitus, who also wrote in his histories, prodigies had occurred, but their expiation by the offering of victims or solemn vows is held to be unlawful by a nation which is the slave of superstition and the enemy of true beliefs. In the sky appeared a vision of armies in conflict, of glittering armor. A sudden lightning flash from the clouds lit up the temple. The doors of the holy place abruptly opened. A superhuman voice was heard to declare that the gods were leaving it, And the same instance came the rushing tumult of their departure. Few people placed a sinister interpretation upon this. The majority were convinced that the ancient scriptures of their priests alluded to the present as the very time when the Orient would triumph and from Judea would go forth men destined to rule the world. Now again, I wasn't there. But these are accounts from that time in history of men who said that they were seeing miraculous signs in the heavens during this period of time. I can't prove whether it did or didn't happen, but these certainly believe that it did. All right, I know we're out of time, so was that interesting at least?
Yeah.
Maybe create more questions and answers, but that's hopefully a good teacher will get you to study more. I do hope that you guys have enjoyed this class. If you are going for the certificate, please at least stay for just a moment so I can look at your notes. And if you would like to have any questions answered about what you need to do for your paper, please let me know. Otherwise, let's close with prayer. Father, I thank you for your word, for your truth, for your gospel, and for the promise that Christ will return. And however and whenever that takes place, Lord, may every person in this room be ready. Lord, let us not be as the foolish virgins who did not have their oil ready. But Lord, help us to be prepared for the time our Savior comes. In Jesus' name, amen.